Margaret sat in the leather chair across from the lawyer's desk, her hands folded in her lap. 3 days had passed since they buried Robert. 3 days since she watched his casket lower into the cold ground. She still wore the black dress from the funeral, and her eyes were tired in a way that sleep could not fix. The lawyer, a thin man named James Morrison with silver hair and kind eyes, adjusted his glasses and looked at the document in front of him. Margaret knew what was coming. Robert had told her months ago, when the cancer became real, that he had made changes to his will. He had held her hand in the darkness of their bedroom and whispered, "I need you to know that you are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten." Those words had meant everything to her then. They meant even more now. The door opened, and Robert's 3 children walked in. Sarah, the oldest, was 45 years old with a sharp face and sharper eyes. She had barely spoken to Margaret at the funeral. Jessica, the middle child, wore pearls, an expression of practiced sympathy that disappeared the moment she thought no one was looking. David, the youngest, looked uncomfortable, as he always did at family gatherings. He had never quite fit with his sisters. Before the lawyer could speak, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled slightly. Jessica leaned toward her and whispered something. Margaret saw it. She saw the exchange of looks. She saw the way they already believed they knew what was about to happen. James Morrison cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is a difficult time. Robert was very clear about his wishes, and I want to make sure everything is handled exactly as he intended." Sarah straightened in her chair. There was an eagerness in her posture that made Margaret's chest tighten. "Robert's estate," the lawyer continued, "is substantial. He has spent a lifetime building it, and he wanted to ensure it was distributed according to his deepest values." Margaret watched Sarah's fingers drum on the armrest. Impatient. Hungry. "First, there are some smaller bequests," James Morrison said, reading from the document. To his longtime friend Marcus, Robert left his fishing equipment and $5,000. To his brother Thomas, he left $10,000 and his watch collection. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. Not the opening she had expected. To his children, the lawyer continued, and Margaret felt the temperature in the room shift. Sarah, Jessica, and David each receive $100,000 and their father's personal photographs and journals. There was a pause. A moment of stunned silence. Then Sarah stood up. "What?" she said, her voice sharp as a knife. 100,000? The house alone is worth $3 million. The Corvettes are worth another $500,000. Where is the rest of it? James Morrison did not flinch. He had expected this reaction. He continued reading. "The family home, valued at $3.2 million, goes to Margaret Ellen Winters, along with all vehicles on the property, including Robert's Corvette collection." "What?" Jessica stood now too, her face flushed. "This is insane. She's not even blood. She's not real family." "The investment accounts, totaling approximately $4.7 million, the lawyer pressed on, also go to Margaret Ellen Winters. As does the life insurance policy worth $2 million. The room erupted. Sarah was yelling, her voice loud and sharp. Jessica was crying, but they were angry tears, tears of rage. David sat very still, staring at the floor. Margaret felt as though she was watching this happen to someone else. She felt separate from her own body, floating above this moment, seeing it all from a distance. "This is illegal," Sarah spat. She manipulated him. She took advantage of a dying man. "We're fighting this." And then came words that would replay in Margaret's mind for years to come. Sarah turned to her daughter, who had entered the room moments before, standing in the doorway. Sarah pointed at Margaret's name on the document and screamed, "Erase her name!" The lawyer's voice cut through the chaos. "There is more," he said quietly, and something in his tone made even Sarah stop. "Robert left a message. He asked that it be played now in this room with all of you present." James Morrison pressed a button on his laptop. The sound of Robert's voice filled the room, weak but clear, recorded just 2 weeks before he died. "My children," Robert began, and Margaret's breath caught. She had not known about this. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone. And you are angry. I know you are angry because you do not understand. Let me tell you what I understand." There was the sound of Robert breathing, struggling slightly. "I married Margaret 32 years ago. She was a teacher, talented and independent. She had dreams of her own. But she chose me. She chose all of you. She gave up the career she wanted to raise you, to support you, to love you. She worked through recessions. She paid for your college. She stayed by my side through chemotherapy and fear and the darkest nights of my life. Sarah had sat back down, but her jaw was clenched. You were busy with your own lives, Robert continued. That is not an accusation. That is the truth. You called on holidays. You sent cards. But Margaret was here. Every single day, Margaret was here. She made me tea when I could not sleep. She held my hand in the hospital. She did not complain. She did not keep score. She simply loved. Margaret felt tears sliding down her face. So I chose to honor that love in the way that matters most. Not because I do not love you. I do. But because love is shown in how you live, in your daily choices, in your sacrifices. And Margaret sacrificed everything. The house, the cars, the money. These are symbols of a life built together. They belong with her. The recording paused. Then Robert's voice came again. Softer now. I hope you will understand. I hope you will look at your own lives and ask yourselves what you have chosen to love. I hope you will find the grace to forgive what you perceive as a slight, and instead see what it truly is. A final act of honoring the woman who loved your father when it would have been easier not to. The recording ended. The room was silent except for the sound of Jessica crying into her hands. Sarah stood up slowly. She looked at Margaret for the first time since the lawyer had finished speaking. There was no anger in her expression anymore. Only confusion, as if she had suddenly realized she did not know who this woman was at all. As if she had never bothered to look. I don't understand, Sarah said quietly. Then she turned and walked out of the room. Jessica followed moments later, her pearls clicking softly against her chest. David remained for another moment, looking at Margaret with an expression she could not read. Then he too stood and left. Margaret sat alone with the lawyer and the documents that changed everything. She had loved Robert for 32 years. She had given him her life, her energy, her future. And for the first time, she was being seen. For the first time, her love was being honored. James Morrison spoke quietly. Your life just changed, Mrs. Winters. Margaret looked at him and realized she was shaking. Not from fear. From something else entirely. From the strange, terrifying, overwhelming feeling of finally being enough. Of finally being chosen. Of finally being seen as family, even if it took her husband's death to make it so. She picked up the copy of the will with her name written across it in bold letters and held it to her chest. Outside the lawyer's office, on the streets of the city where she had built her quiet, invisible life of devotion, the world continued on, unchanged. But Margaret Winters had been transformed in an instant. From a woman without a name to a woman finally called by her own. The photograph sat on Margaret's nightstand in a silver frame. Robert stood in the backyard of their first house, smiling at the camera with his arm around her. She was 28 years old, her hair long and dark, her smile genuine and full of hope. It was 1992. The world felt wide open. The future felt endless. She had been teaching high school English then, a job she loved with a passion that consumed her. Every evening, she came home with stories of difficult students who suddenly understood the beauty of Shakespeare, of teenagers who had never thought of themselves as writers until she showed them they could be. She had plans to get her master's degree. She had dreams of writing a novel. She had built a life that was entirely her own. Then she met Robert at her sister's wedding. He was 40 years old, divorced, with 3 children from his first marriage. Sarah was 16, Jessica was 14, and David was 12. Robert was handsome in a quiet way, with kind eyes and a laugh that made people feel safe. He was a successful businessman, the owner of a construction company that had made him wealthy. But what Margaret noticed first was not his success. It was the way he looked at his children with a mixture of love and helplessness, as if he did not know how to reach them anymore after the divorce. They dated for 2 years. During that time, Margaret spent weekends with Robert's children. She learned that Sarah was angry about the divorce in a way that made her push people away. She learned that Jessica needed attention but did not know how to ask for it without drama. She learned that David, the youngest, was afraid of being abandoned and clung to his father like a life raft. Robert proposed on a quiet evening in their apartment. He asked her not just to marry him, but to become a stepmother to his children. He was honest about what that would mean. He told her it would be hard. He told her that the children might never fully accept her. He told her that she would be giving up something of herself. Margaret said yes anyway. The wedding was small. The children attended but did not smile in the photographs. Margaret wore a white dress that Robert had loved, and she made a promise not just to him, but to herself. She would love these three people as if they were her own, whether they ever loved her back or not. The first year was brutal. Sarah refused to call her Margaret. She called her that woman, or sometimes just ignored her completely. Jessica tested boundaries constantly, staying out late, bringing home boys, doing anything she could to shock and upset. David was clingy in a way that made Sarah mock him for it. The house was loud with conflict, and Margaret was caught in the middle of it all. She quit her master's degree program. She could not manage teaching, her studies, and navigating the minefield of a blended family. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself it was just for a few years until everyone adjusted. The few years became a decade. By the time Sarah was 25, she had calmed down somewhat, though she still kept Margaret at a distance. She came home for holidays but treated the house like a hotel, arriving late and leaving early. Jessica had become a successful marketing executive with a sharp edge to her personality that Margaret recognized as inherited from her father. She was brilliant and driven, but she had no patience for what she called Margaret's saccharine optimism. David, now in his early 20s, was the only one who had truly bonded with Margaret. He called her often, asked her advice, hugged her when he came to visit. But Sarah and Jessica called this weakness. They made fun of him for being too sensitive, for being too attached to a stepmother. Margaret had stopped counting the years she had sacrificed. She had stopped thinking about the novel she had wanted to write. She had stopped believing in the dreams she used to have. Instead, she became the person who held everything together. When Sarah got pregnant at 23 without being married, Margaret was the one who helped her find a good doctor, who attended prenatal appointments with her, who set up the nursery while Sarah pretended to be fine but was secretly terrified. When Jessica had a breakdown at work and could not function for 3 months, Margaret took her calls at 3 in the morning and listened without judgment. When David struggled with depression in his 20s, Margaret researched therapists and paid for his treatment without telling him that she was the one doing it. She paid for college. She paid for graduate school. She paid for down payments on houses and emergency car repairs and medical bills. She worked. She never complained. She simply did what needed to be done. Robert watched all of this with increasing awareness. He saw the way Margaret had become invisible. He saw the way his children took her presence for granted, the way they called only when they needed something, the way they never asked about her day or her dreams or what she wanted anymore. In 1998, when Margaret was 34 years old, she got an offer. A prestigious private school wanted her to come back to teaching. They wanted her to lead their entire English department. They offered her a salary that would have allowed her to finally pursue the life she had put on hold. It was everything she had sacrificed for. She turned it down. Robert asked her why, though he already knew the answer. "Jessica is having trouble at work," Margaret said quietly. "Sarah's baby is sick. David is struggling. You need me here. They need me here." Robert took her face in his hands that night and made her look at him. "What about what you need?" he asked. Margaret did not have an answer. She had stopped needing things a long time ago. The 2000s brought a strange kind of routine. Margaret became the constant in a family that was constantly changing. She hosted holidays. She listened to problems. She offered advice that was rarely taken. She made meals that went uneaten when schedules changed. She kept photo albums and sent birthday cards and remembered anniversaries. By 2015, when Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Margaret had been married to him for 23 years. She had spent more than 2 decades loving people who treated her as an obligation rather than a gift. She had built a life entirely around their needs, and in doing so, had nearly erased herself completely. The cancer diagnosis changed something in Robert. It made him see what Margaret had given up, and what his children had taken for granted. He watched her care for him through chemotherapy with a tenderness that broke his heart. He watched her leave his side only for work, only for the minutes she needed to keep them afloat financially. He watched her age, watched the light in her eyes dim slightly, watched the woman he had married slowly disappear into the role of caretaker. He began to keep a journal during his illness. He wrote about Margaret. He wrote about how she had shown up every single day, how she had loved without keeping score, how she had given everything. He wrote about his children and their selfishness, not out of anger but out of recognition. He wrote about what he wished he had done differently, about how he wished he had protected Margaret better, honored her more, valued her sooner. And he made a decision. He would not die without making sure that Margaret was finally seen. He would not leave this world without ensuring that the love she had given so freely was returned to her in a way that mattered. He would use his death to finally give her what she had given to everyone else. A choice. A future. A life that belonged to her. On the night before Robert went to his lawyer to change his will, he held Margaret's hand in their bedroom. She thought he might tell her what he was about to do, but instead he just looked at her with eyes full of love and regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" Margaret asked. "For not seeing you sooner," Robert said. "For not protecting you better. For not making sure the people I love know how to love you the way you deserve." Margaret cried that night, not because she was sad, but because for the first time in decades, someone had finally seen her. Robert had seen all the invisible years, all the small sacrifices, all the dreams she had abandoned. He had seen her. And he was going to make sure that everyone else saw her too. The cancer took him 6 months later. But in those 6 months, Robert had set everything in motion. He had worked with James Morrison to craft a new will, one that would finally honor the woman who had become the true backbone of his family. He had recorded a message that would speak for him long after he was gone. He had made a choice that would shake his family to its foundation and force them to reckon with what they had lost in Margaret. He had chosen justice wrapped in love. Margaret did not know any of this as she sat by his bedside in the final weeks, holding his hand, reading to him, simply being present. But Robert knew. And the knowledge gave him peace. He died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with Margaret asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his. When she woke and realized he was gone, she did not scream. She simply held him and thanked him for seeing her. For finally, after all these years, making her visible. James Morrison's office was on the 32nd floor of a glass building downtown. Margaret had never been there before. Robert had always handled their legal matters, always been the one to make decisions about money and property and the future. Now she sat in the waiting room 3 weeks after Robert's funeral, still wearing clothes that felt like they belonged to a ghost. The lawyer had called her and asked her to come alone. He said there were things she needed to understand about Robert's final wishes before the will reading with the children. Margaret had agreed, though she had no idea what to expect. James Morrison was a man in his 60s with silver hair and a face that had seen many difficult conversations. He greeted Margaret with genuine warmth, not the practiced sympathy of a professional, but something deeper. He had known Robert for 15 years, he explained. Robert had trusted him with more than just legal documents. He had trusted him with secrets. "Your husband came to see me about 18 months ago," James began, gesturing for Margaret to sit across from his desk. He was already ill, though he was still trying to hide it from people. But Robert was never very good at hiding things from people who really saw him. "And I saw him." Margaret listened, her hands folded in her lap. "He asked me a question that most people never ask," James continued. "He asked me what he owed to the people he loved. Not legally but morally. Spiritually. He wanted to know if there was a way to use his death as a final act of love, rather than just a transaction." The lawyer stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "Robert told me everything," James said quietly. "He told me about Margaret. He told me about the life you had given up. He told me about the career you abandoned, the dreams you set aside, the decades you spent making everyone else's life better while your own became smaller and smaller. He cried when he told me these things. Not because he was sad about dying, but because he was sad about what you had sacrificed." Margaret felt tears beginning to form, but she held them back. "So we made a plan," James said, turning back to face her. "Your husband spent the last 18 months of his life working with me to create a will that would do more than just divide his assets. It would tell a truth. It would make visible what had been invisible for so long." James returned to his desk and opened a leather folder. Inside were documents but also something else. A USB drive. "Robert recorded a message," James said. "He did it in stages, as the cancer progressed. He wanted it to be his voice, his real voice, speaking to his children about what he saw and what it meant. But before the will reading, he wanted you to hear it first. He wanted you to know that you were not alone in seeing what had happened to you. He wanted you to know that someone had finally witnessed your sacrifice and had chosen to honor it. James handed Margaret the USB drive. Their fingers touched briefly, and Margaret felt something pass between them. An understanding. A recognition of what was about to unfold. Go home and listen to this, James said gently. Then come back, and we will face them together. That night, Margaret sat alone in the house that had been her sanctuary and her prison for 32 years. She put the USB drive into her laptop with shaking hands. Robert's voice filled the darkness of the living room. Margaret, my love, he began, and she could hear the pain in his voice, the effort it took to speak. If you are hearing this, then I am gone. I am sorry. I wanted to stay longer. I wanted to watch you finally claim the life that should have been yours all along. He paused to catch his breath. I need to tell you something that I should have said 1,000 times but never did. I need to tell you that I see you. I have always seen you, but I did not always acknowledge it, and for that I am deeply sorry. You came into my life when you did not have to. You chose a man with baggage, with children who were angry and lost, with a future that was uncertain. You made that choice knowing it would cost you something. Knowing it would change you. Robert's voice grew stronger. And then you gave everything. Year after year you gave. You gave your time, your energy, your dreams. You paid for their education. You held them when they cried. You forgave them when they were cruel. You never asked for recognition. You never kept score. You simply loved. And I watched you become smaller because of it. I watched the light in your eyes dim. I watched you disappear into the role of caretaker, and I did not stop it. I did not protect you. I did not honor what you were giving. Margaret was crying now, her body shaking with sobs she had held back for decades. My children will be angry when they hear this, Robert continued. They will not understand. They will think I am betraying them. But I am not betraying them. I am finally being honest with them. I am showing them what love really looks like. I am showing them that family is not determined by blood. Family is determined by who shows up. Family is determined by who stays. Family is determined by sacrifice and presence and the daily choice to put someone else's well-being before your own. There was a long pause. Margaret could hear Robert breathing, struggling. Sarah, Jessica, David. I love you. But I did not teach you to honor the woman who honored you. And that is my failure. That is what I am trying to correct now, though I know it will be painful. I am giving Margaret the house, the cars, the money, not to punish you, but to finally honor her. To finally say that her love was seen, and it was real and it mattered. Robert's voice became very quiet. And Margaret, my darling, I am giving you these things because you deserve them. Not because I owe you anything, but because I want the world to know that you were chosen. You were valued. You were loved. You were finally, after all these years, enough. The recording ended. Margaret sat in the darkness for a long time. She did not move. She did not cry anymore. She simply sat with the weight of finally being seen, of finally being honored, of finally being enough. The next morning, she returned to James Morrison's office. The lawyer smiled when she walked in, and Margaret could see in his expression that he knew. He knew that Robert's words had reached her. He knew that she had heard what her husband had been trying to say for decades. Are you ready? James asked gently. Margaret nodded. The will reading was scheduled for noon. By the time Sarah, Jessica, and David arrived, Margaret was seated in the chair beside the lawyer. She wore a black dress, her hair was pulled back neatly, and her hands were steady. She looked at Robert's children, her stepchildren, though she had never truly been allowed to claim that title, and felt something shift inside her. Not anger. Not bitterness. But clarity. James Morrison read through the legal language. He explained the assets, the valuations, the conditions. And then he played the recording. When Robert's voice filled the room, Sarah stood up immediately. But then she stopped. She listened. She heard her father speaking truths that could not be denied, could not be argued with, could not be dismissed. When the recording ended and James announced the distribution of the estate, Sarah screamed. Jessica cried angry tears. David stared at the floor. But it was done. The truth had been spoken. The injustice had been addressed. After the initial shock subsided, there was a moment of stillness. James Morrison had excused himself to give them privacy. Margaret sat alone with her 3 stepchildren in the conference room. Sarah looked at her with something like hatred. You planned this, she said coldly. You manipulated him while he was sick. You took advantage of a dying man. Margaret looked at her stepdaughter, this woman she had loved for 32 years despite never being asked to, despite never being welcomed, and she finally spoke her truth. I did not plan anything, Margaret said quietly. Your father planned this. Your father made this choice because he finally saw what I had given and what you had not. Not because I asked him to. Not because I wanted his money. Because he loved me enough to honor me after decades of watching me honor everyone else without being honored in return. Jessica shook her head. She's not family, she said bitterly. We're blood. We're the real family. And Margaret stood up. She had waited 32 years to say what she was about to say. She had waited through decades of being erased, dismissed, taken for granted. She had waited for the moment when she could finally claim her own truth. Blood does not make a family, Margaret said, her voice steady and clear. Love makes a family. Respect makes a family. Being there when it is hard and inconvenient makes a family. I was there for all of you. Not because I had to be. Not because I was your blood. But because I chose to love you. And your father finally saw that. He finally honored that. Whether you can accept it or not, that is the truth. David looked up at her, and Margaret saw tears in his eyes. But he did not speak. He was caught between loyalty to his sisters and recognition of the truth. Margaret did not wait for him to choose. She gathered her things and stood to leave. I do not expect you to understand today, Margaret said at the door. And I do not need your approval. I only needed your father to see me. And he did. He finally saw me. That is enough. She walked out of the conference room, down the hallway, into the elevator, and out onto the street. The world looked the same, but she felt entirely different. For the first time in 32 years, Margaret Winters was not invisible. She was not erased. She was not convenient. She was loved. She was honored. She was finally, after all these years, enough. That evening, Margaret sat in the house that was now entirely hers. She looked at the photographs on the walls, pictures of holidays and celebrations, moments she had organized and created and made beautiful for people who rarely thanked her. She looked at Robert's empty chair in the living room. She thought about the years that were gone, the dreams that were abandoned, the woman she used to be. And then she made a decision. She would not spend the rest of her life mourning what she had lost. Instead, she would use what she had been given to create something new. Something meaningful. Something that would ensure that no other woman like her would have to spend decades invisible, waiting for someone to finally see her worth. 6 months after Robert's death, Margaret stood in the backyard of her house with dirt under her fingernails and sweat on her forehead. The memorial garden was taking shape. She had spent weeks planning it, researching plants that would bloom in different seasons, choosing a stone bench where people could sit and remember. In the center, she had planted Robert's favorite roses, the deep red ones that he had always said reminded him of blood and passion and the things worth fighting for. A young woman approached her across the lawn. Her name was Claire, and she was the director of a non-profit organization that helped blended families navigate conflict and build connection. Margaret had reached out to them 3 months ago with an idea, and they had embraced it immediately. The foundation is officially registered, Claire said, handing Margaret a leather folder. Margaret's Bridge. A foundation dedicated to supporting blended families and ensuring that stepmothers, stepfathers, and step-siblings are recognized and valued as equal members of the family unit. Margaret looked at the folder with her name on it, and for a moment she could not speak. Margaret's Bridge. A name that meant something. A name that mattered. We already have commitments from 3 major donors, Claire continued. We have interest from schools, counseling centers, and family therapists who want to partner with us. Your story, Margaret, your courage, it's changing how people think about family. Margaret smiled, but it was a sad smile. She thought about how it had taken her husband's death for anyone to care about her story. She thought about how many women were still invisible, still sacrificing, still waiting to be seen. I want to do more than just give money, Margaret said. I want to teach. I want to help other women understand their own worth before it takes a will reading to prove it. And so Margaret did something she had given up 32 years ago. She went back to teaching. She returned to the private school that had offered her the prestigious position in 1998. They were shocked when she called. They were thrilled when she explained what she wanted to do. She did not teach English literature anymore. Instead, she taught a new course called Finding Your Voice: Women, Families, and Self-Worth. She taught young women about the danger of disappearing into the roles others created for them. She taught them that love should never require the erasure of self. She taught them that family is what you build, not what you are born into. Her students adored her. They saw in Margaret a woman who had learned hard truths the hard way, and who was determined that they would not have to. She became known as the teacher who actually listened, who saw you, who made you believe that your dreams mattered and that your worth was not determined by how useful you were to other people. 3 months into teaching, David came to visit. He arrived on a Saturday morning with flowers in his hand and an apology in his eyes. He was 38 years old now, with children of his own, and Margaret could see in his face the man he had become. He was the one who had loved her most, even when his sisters had mocked him for it. He was the one who had tried to bridge the gap between Margaret and the family, even when it had seemed impossible. "I've thought about what you said," David began, sitting at the kitchen table where Margaret had fed this man breakfast for 30 years. "I've thought about it every single day. And I've realized that you were right. About all of it." Margaret made him tea, the way she had always made him tea, and listened. "I was a coward," David said quietly. "I knew Sarah and Jessica were wrong. I knew they were being cruel to you. But I did nothing. I let them control the narrative. I let them make me feel ashamed for loving you, for respecting you, for seeing what you had sacrificed. And I'm sorry. I am so deeply sorry." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "You were their brother," she said gently. "You were caught between loyalty and truth. I don't blame you. I never blamed you." David cried that morning, sitting at her kitchen table, mourning the years that had been lost to silence and shame. But he also began to heal. And Margaret, for the first time in her life, received an apology from someone she loved without having to minimize their guilt or comfort their conscience. She simply accepted what he was offering: acknowledgement, regret, change. David's children began visiting Margaret regularly. Her step-grandchildren who had barely known her before now spent weekends at the house, playing in the memorial garden, listening to stories about their grandfather, learning that love came in many forms and that family was something you chose to honor every single day. Jessica was harder. She resisted for a long time. She tried to tell herself that Margaret had somehow manipulated Robert, that the will was not what he truly wanted, that Margaret had won because she was clever and cunning. But those stories became harder to maintain as the months passed. Jessica began to notice things. She noticed that Margaret did not flaunt her wealth. She noticed that Margaret donated most of Robert's money to the Foundation for Blended Families. She noticed that Margaret lived simply, taught for a modest salary, and seemed to be building a life based on meaning rather than comfort. A year after Robert's death, Jessica requested a meeting with Margaret. They met at a coffee shop, neutral territory, a place where they could both escape if things became too difficult. Jessica looked older than she had at the will reading. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. "I've been in therapy," Jessica said without preamble. "My therapist asked me why I hated you so much. And I realized something. I don't hate you. I hate the fact that you showed us something we didn't want to see about ourselves. You showed us what unconditional love looked like, and we rejected it because we didn't know how to accept it. We were so focused on what we thought we deserved that we couldn't see what you were giving." Margaret listened, saying nothing. "I've talked to Sarah," Jessica continued. "She's not ready yet. But I think she will be. I think she's starting to understand. And I wanted to apologize. I wanted to tell you that you were right. That family is not blood. That love is shown in how you show up, day after day, year after year." Margaret and Jessica did not become close friends. Some bridges take longer to build than others. But they began a new relationship based on honest recognition rather than resentment. Jessica started volunteering with Margaret's Bridge. She used her marketing expertise to help the foundation reach more people. She began to see Margaret not as a rival or an intruder, but as a woman who had loved her and her family even when that love was not returned. Sarah was the last to come around. It took 2 years. But when she finally reached out, she did so through a letter. Margaret found it in her mailbox on a rainy Tuesday morning. "I have spent 2 years angry at you and at my father," Sarah had written. "I have spent 2 years refusing to acknowledge what I could not accept. But my daughter asked me recently why I wasn't close to you, Why I seemed to have so much anger towards someone who had only been kind to me. And I couldn't answer her. I realized that I had no good reason. I had only fear and pride and the unwillingness to admit that I had been wrong. The letter went on to describe Sarah's own journey. She had gotten divorced. She had faced her own struggles. She had come to understand, finally, what it meant to be in a position of vulnerability, to need someone, to realize that love was not a transaction but a gift. I would like to know you, Sarah's letter concluded. Not as the woman who took my inheritance. Not as the woman who manipulated my father. But as a human being. As someone my father loved. As someone who loved me even when I did not deserve it. I don't know if that's possible, but I would like to try. Margaret cried when she read that letter. She cried for the years that had been lost. She cried for the love that had been rejected. But she also cried for the possibility of redemption, for the chance to finally build something real with her stepdaughter. They began slowly. Coffee dates. Lunch. Eventually, Sarah came to the house and sat in the memorial garden with Margaret. They talked about Robert. They talked about the past. They talked about the future. They did not become close overnight, but they began to build a genuine relationship based on mutual respect and the shared understanding that they had both been hurt by their own fears and limitations. 2 years after Robert's death, Margaret published a memoir. She called it, Finally Seen, My Journey from Invisible to Irreplaceable. The book told her story with unflinching honesty. She wrote about her sacrifices without self-pity. She wrote about her stepchildren without condemning them. She wrote about Robert with love and gratitude. And she wrote about the woman she had become in the aftermath of his death. A woman who had learned that her worth did not depend on how useful she was to others. The book resonated with thousands of people. Blended families contacted her with their own stories. Stepmothers reached out to say that they had felt seen for the first time. Adult children wrote to confess that they had taken their stepparents for granted. People from all walks of life wrote to say that Margaret's story had changed how they thought about family, about sacrifice, about love. Margaret's bridge grew. The foundation now offered counseling services, educational programs, support groups, and scholarships for students from blended families. Margaret served as the director, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that no one else would have to spend decades invisible and unappreciated. 5 years after Robert's death, on what would have been their 37-year anniversary, Margaret sat in the memorial garden with her entire blended family. David was there with his wife and children. Jessica was there with her partner. Sarah was there with her daughter and grandchildren. And they gathered around the bench that Margaret had placed among Robert's roses. Margaret had written a letter to be read aloud on this day. It was not as lengthy as Robert's recorded message, but it was equally powerful. My family, she began, her voice steady and clear. I want to thank you for finally seeing me. Not all of you saw me at the same time. Not all of you came to this understanding easily. But you all came. You all chose to look at the truth, even when it was painful. You all chose to build something new with me instead of clinging to the past. She looked at each of them in turn. I want you to know that I do not hold the years of invisibility against you. I understand now that you were all struggling in your own ways. You were all trying to navigate a family structure that is complicated and messy and often impossible to understand. But I also want you to know that my sacrifice was not your fault. My erasure was not your fault. That was something I allowed to happen. That was my responsibility, and I have learned from it. Margaret paused, looking out at the garden that Robert's money had helped create, but that Margaret's love had built. I hope that by telling my story, by writing my book, by creating Margaret's Bridge, I can help other people avoid the trap I fell into. I hope I can help other women understand that love is not about disappearing. I hope I can help families understand that honoring one member means honoring all members. And I hope I can help us all learn that family is not something you are born into. It is something you choose every single day, through your actions, your presence, your willingness to see and be seen. She folded the letter and looked at the faces around her. Your father loved me, she said simply. And he taught me that being loved means being visible. It means being valued. It means being enough exactly as you are. That is the greatest gift he ever gave me. Not money. Not property. But the knowledge that I was finally, after all those years, truly enough. That night, after everyone had left, Margaret sat alone in the house and thought about the woman she used to be. She thought about the young teacher with long dark hair and dreams of writing a novel. She thought about the woman who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. She thought about the decades of invisibility. And then she thought about who she was now. She thought about the teacher standing in front of young women, teaching them their own worth. She thought about the founder of Margaret's Bridge, helping blended families learn to honor each other. She thought about the author whose words had touched thousands of people. She thought about the woman who had finally claimed her own voice. She had lost 32 years. That was the truth she had to live with. But she had gained so much more than money could ever buy. She had gained herself. She had gained the understanding that her love mattered. She had gained the knowledge that being seen, truly seen, by even one person could transform an entire life. Margaret walked to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea. She sat by the window and watched the stars come out over the garden where Robert's roses were blooming. She thought about how sometimes the greatest acts of love are the quiet ones. The daily choices. The moments of presence. The decision to stay when it would be easier to leave. She thought about how justice could be quiet. How it could be patient. How it could be wrapped in love and delivered as a final gift from someone who had learned too late what they should have known all along. Margaret looked at her reflection in the window and smiled. She was 56 years old. She was beginning her life over. She was finally, after all these years, free to be exactly who she had always wanted to be. And as she sat in the peaceful silence of her own home, a home that was finally truly hers, Margaret made a promise to herself. She would spend the rest of her life making sure that other invisible women found their voice. She would spend the rest of her life ensuring that sacrifice was recognized. She would spend the rest of her life teaching people that family is built on daily choices, on presence, on the willingness to see and honor the people we love. That was her legacy. That was what Robert's death had made possible. That was the transformation that happens when someone finally, after everything, chooses to truly see you. If this story has touched your heart, if you have seen yourself in Margaret's journey, if you have felt the weight of being invisible or the joy of finally being seen, then I want to hear from you. Please like this video. Please share it with someone who needs to know that their love matters, that their sacrifice is worthy of recognition, that they are enough exactly as they are. Please subscribe to our channel for more stories of heartwarming transformation and real human connection that will remind you what truly matters in life. And please, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We absolutely love hearing from you from all around the world, from people who believe that family is what you choose, that love is what you do, and that being seen, truly seen, is the greatest gift any of us can ever receive. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that stories like Margaret's matter.